The first time Ayaan saw Meera, it was raining. Not the kind of soft drizzle that dances on window panes, but the kind of wild, unapologetic monsoon that soaked your soul before it touched your skin. He was standing under the makeshift roof of his bookstore, trying to protect the piles of old books from the downpour, when she ran across the street drenched, breathless, with laughter spilling from her lips as if she belonged to the rain. She ducked under the same roof, their eyes meeting briefly. He offered her a towel. Slightly embarrassed, it smelled like old paper and sea salt. "I love rains," she said, her voice a melody that stuck with him. "They wash away everything fake." Ayaan wasn't the kind who talked much. He lived in stories, buried under pages of forgotten novels and dog-eared poetry. But something about her made him respond. They also ruined first editions. And just like that, she became a part of his world. Meera was staying in the town for 3 months, an artist on a self-imposed retreat. She had a little studio apartment on the top floor of an old Portuguese house overlooking the beach. Her days were spent painting, and her evenings were often spent in Ayaan's bookstore, sitting cross-legged between poetry shelves, sipping tea and discussing Rumi, Neruda, and sometimes silence. She asked him once, "Why don't you write?" "I do," he replied, in margins. That day, she found a copy of The Little Prince, opened it, and found scribbled notes in the margins. Thoughts, questions, and sometimes heartbreaks disguised as sentences. She read them all like prayers. "I want to paint your thoughts," she said one evening, her voice soft like rain again. He was falling for her, slowly, like the tide pulling at the shore, inevitable, gentle, and wild. One night, there was a power cut. The storm had returned, wilder this time. Meera arrived at the bookstore barefoot, clutching candles and a flask of chai. They sat by the window, the monsoon raging outside, a single candle between them. She whispered, "I'm scared of endings." He looked at her. "I don't want to go back to the city. It's loud and gray. This town, everything feels like home. You don't have to leave," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I must," she said. "Art galleries, exhibitions, life." Ayaan nodded. He wanted to ask her to stay, but something in him stopped. Love, he believed, wasn't about caging birds. It was about letting them fly and praying they return. They never used the word love. It sat between them like a poem too sacred to name. They walked the beach barefoot. They kissed in alleys. They fought over poetry interpretations. She painted him sometimes literally, on her canvas, and sometimes figuratively, through her words. She taught him how to look at colors, and he taught her how to listen to silence. Days melted into nights, and time became a slow dance, until it didn't. Her last night in town was quiet. No storms, no rain, just a heavy stillness in the air. They sat on the beach, waves licking their toes, their hands entwined. "Will you remember me?" she asked, staring at the horizon. "I'll read your paintings," he replied, "and I'll read your margins." They didn't kiss that night. They just sat, heartbeats loud, time slipping away like sand through fingers. The next morning, she left. Weeks passed, then months. The bookstore felt emptier. The poetry section, lonelier. Ayaan still scribbled in margins. But his words were heavier, now shaped like loss, shadowed by memory. She sent letters. Postcards with brush strokes and single lines. "Today I painted the sky the color of your eyes. The city is loud, and I miss our silences." But she never returned, and he never left. 5 years had passed. The bookstore still stood, older now, like its owner. Ayaan's hair had streaks of gray, but his eyes held the same depth. He had published a book, a collection of margin notes. It was called Beneath the Monsoon Skies. Critics called it raw, haunting, and beautiful. One monsoon morning, a little girl walked into the store. She was no more than 6, with big curious eyes and a sketchbook in hand. "Are you Mr. Ayaan?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, puzzled. She handed him a letter. He opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Ayaan, if you're reading this, it means you've met my daughter, Nur. Yes, she's mine. She's also yours in more ways than you can imagine. I should have told you, but I was scared. Of myself, of love, of the world. I didn't want to bind you in a life you hadn't asked for. I know it's not fair. I've been unfair to you in many ways. But I painted every day, and in each stroke, there was a piece of you. Every gallery, every applause, every lonely night I remembered you. I'm not writing this from the city. I'm writing it from a hospital. The rains are here again. They've always reminded me of you, of us. If anything happens to me, please take care of Noor. She's curious like you. Loves poetry, though she doesn't understand it yet. Teach her the difference between noise and silence. Show her the stars from the beach. Tell her our story but make it sound like a fairy tale. And Ayaan, I loved you. I still do. Meera. Tears rolled down Ayaan's cheeks as the sky outside rumbled. He looked at Noor, who was now flipping through a poetry book with wide eyes. He knelt down and hugged her gently. Do you like stories? He asked. She nodded. Would you like to hear one? It starts with a boy who loved the rain and a girl who danced in it. And as the rain poured again, washing over the town like a memory, Ayaan began the story not with sadness, but with a smile. Because love, like monsoon, always returned, even if in different forms.